On this wild and wonderful Wednesday edition of Locked On Grizzlies, there's not much to talk about with the Grizzlies-Spurs game, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to do my best to analyze it. I'm back after my WrestleMania trip. Maybe I'll talk about some stories of that. Brandon Clarke did some good things. Maybe he could still play the center position for Memphis. That's worth mentioning. And the Grizzlies have another basketball game tonight. Fortunately, unfortunately, it's the last week of the regular season. Let's get through it together here on Locked On Grizzlies. Lock in with me.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
If you smell something strange on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Grizzlies, no, we haven't adopted smell-o-vision at the Locked On Podcast Network. That would be cool. And no, I don't think anything is leaving me in terms of toxins leaving my body after a crazy weekend in Philadelphia with WrestleMania 40 and coming out to you. Keep that away from you, right? It wasn't that crazy, but I had a blast. Shout out to DeMichael Cole for filling in for me. I am your host for this episode, Joe Mullinax, back with you on Locked On Grizzlies. Excited to talk Grizzlies basketball over these next 30 minutes or so. Maybe a little bit shorter because there's not much Grizzlies basketball to talk about right now. Even though the team played last night, they're playing again tonight. I got to keep it real with you. I'll never lie to you, dear listener, dear viewer. It's tough in the Memphis Grizzlies streets at this moment. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. We're proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. DeMichael and I have had an episode each and every day of April. I'm not going to pretend like we're not going to take a break at some point, given the way this season is concluded. Obviously, we have the end-of-season media availability. That'll give us several things to talk about next week. So we'll keep chugging along here on Locked On Grizzlies every time an episode drops, whether you check it out on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get podcasts. Like, comment, rate, review. Most importantly, subscribe. Interact with us as we continue to build Locked On Grizzlies and as you continue to, hopefully, even as the regular season mercifully comes to an end soon, hopefully you'll stick around with us as the offseason begins starting next week here on Locked On Grizzlies. As I mentioned, lots of fun at WrestleMania. This isn't Locked On WWE. This isn't Locked On WrestleMania. I'd love to talk about finishing stories and final bosses, but that's not why I am employed by the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. So we are going to try to talk about the craziness that was Tuesday night in the NBA for the Memphis Grizzlies. And again, you come here, dear listener, dear viewer, each and every day, hopefully, as an everydayer, looking for conversation about your favorite team, in this particular case, the Memphis Grizzlies. And I'm happy to provide that to you. I mean, again, if you followed my career going all the way back to my blogging days at Grizzly Bear Blues, I've been covering this team for over a decade now. And I remember what it looks like when the Grizzlies have tanked in the past. It has occurred as recently as, the 2018-ish time frame, right? So 6 years ago, my eyes and my brain still have memories of that time. Goodness gracious, this is bad. And it was bad back then, too. I want to stress that. But the starting five for the Memphis Grizzlies against the San Antonio Spurs on Tuesday night. Brandon Clarke, potential starter next season. We'll talk more about that later on in the show, and I'm sure it'll be a topic of conversation with DeMichael and I all offseason long, especially as the draft and free agency approach. G.G. Jackson, another player that I have planted my flag firmly saying he should be the sixth-man bucket getter off the bench for the team next year. Last night was a good argument against him as a starter. And again, it's just one game. Literally no one else that played for the Memphis Grizzlies in this contest against the Spurs is going to be an active member of the rotation next year. They may be in the organization. Trey Jemison continues to set screens well, competed admirably against the size of Victor Wembanyama when he had his chance to. Jemison probably should stick around on a two-way. Scottie Pippen, same kind of deal. Not his best game against San Antonio, but we've seen enough of Scottie Pippen Jr. Two-way contract, maybe a conversion to a standard deal if something happens with Derrick Rose. Something like that, I'm cool with having that conversation. Outside of those guys, and again, those are two dudes that theoretically, when the team is healthy, they should be spending more time in South Haven, Mississippi with the Memphis Hustle than they are spending with the Memphis Grizzlies. So you had two dudes that are actually going to be playing for the Memphis Grizzlies next year when they're trying to be good and contending in the Western Conference again against the San Antonio Spurs. And the Spurs are 7 games worse than the Memphis Grizzlies at this stage of the regular season in terms of record after San Antonio's win, which snapped a streak, by the way. The Grizzlies, it was like something 13 games in a row that Memphis had beaten San Antonio. The streak is over. San Antonio snaps it here in this last week of the regular season with no Jaren Jackson Jr., no John Morant, no Desmond Bane, no Marcus Smart, no Vince Williams Jr. I could go up and down the list of the guys that didn't play in this contest. We've officially reached the warm body portion of this gap year, lost season, whatever you want to call it. So it's really important to not try to make an overall statement based off of one game, really anytime, right? But especially right now. And I'm going to practice that discipline when it comes to G.G. Jackson, because as I mentioned, I believe it's been a while since I went on my trip. The last time we were together, dear listener, dear viewer, I planted that G.G. flag, said he should be a reserve. He can't play as a starter, or at least he shouldn't. Maybe can't isn't the right word. He shouldn't play as a starter because of the fact that eventually you'll have John Morant and Desmond Bane and Jaren Jackson Jr. He makes more sense alongside one of those guys in a reserve grouping. Because again, nobody really plays a true bench 5 anymore, a true second team. So GG with Bane, cool. GG with Ja, yeah. GG with Jaren Jackson Jr., we've seen that work. GG Jackson with all 3 of them at the same time, I'm not sure that's the best use of him considering he's not the best creator of offense for others right now. Ironically, this is a game where he had a couple of assists. There's been plenty of times this year where he's had 0 or 1 assist. So multiple assists for GG in this contest across 28 minutes of play. But GG was a team worst, minus 14 in single game plus minus. And again, flawed stat. All metrics are flawed. All numbers are flawed, right? You can twist and mold them to say literally whatever you want. But in the flattest of terms, the Grizzlies lost by 14 points the minutes that GG Jackson was on the floor. Compare that to Jemison, Jordan Goodwin. But again, that's a guy that's almost certainly not going to be with the team in terms of rotation next year. Maybe he's on the 3rd two-way contract. Maybe. Scottie Pippen Jr., those guys had better minutes, at least in terms of that plus-minus stat. But that one game against a bad Spurs team in this final week of the regular season that you and I are paying attention to, you because you are a fanatic of the Memphis Grizzlies, or you love basketball, or you love FanDuel, one of the great sponsors of Locked On Grizzlies. Maybe you're in one of those boats. Maybe you're in all of them. This is not the time to criticize an individual poor shooting performance. GG Jackson is well beyond his ideal role. Brandon Clarke was the best player that the Memphis Grizzlies played on Tuesday night. And he's coming off of a serious Achilles injury. He's looked phenomenal, don't get me wrong. Another good game, especially offensively for him. We'll talk more about that. So the point is, nobody right now is playing in their ideal role. Brandon Clarke maybe as a starter. Maybe. We'll talk more about that here in a minute. But that's not his ideal place, being the best player on the floor for Memphis. GG Jackson, maybe a starter. He's earned being in the conversation among Vince Williams Jr., Marcus Smart. Maybe a major trade happens. We'll talk more about that as the offseason grinds along. But being the second best player for the Memphis Grizzlies is probably not an ideal role for GG Jackson. I can probably take out the probably and insert a certainly. So, yeah, GG could have shot better. And yeah, you would have liked to have seen Goodwin and Pippen score a little bit more effectively. But your starting backcourt was Jordan Goodwin and Scottie Pippen Jr. They shot 9 of 30. Yeah, that stinks. But they should have been shooting better for a G League team getting ready for a playoff push as opposed to a NBA team closing out their regular season. And that's really the main takeaway, at least for me. This game was just another reminder of how poorly this season has gone for Memphis in terms of their health. And this is what they've come to. I'm guessing a lot of the guys on the injury report, maybe not a lot, several of them, if Memphis was playing for seeding, they'd be playing. But because they're not, you limp into the end of the season and you cross your fingers for ping pong balls once the playoffs get underway. One of the guys that thankfully is still playing because he hasn't played as much this season due to that serious injury is Brandon Clarke. He continues to look good. Could he be a starting center for the Memphis Grizzlies? We've talked briefly about this in the past. I haven't had a chance to give my full 2 cents in. We'll talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Game Time. I had a blast over the weekend at WrestleMania. Getting tickets was wonderfully easy. I used the Game Time app to help peruse, compare prices, all those sorts of things. It is a lot of fun using Game Time. Can't stress that enough. You can obviously use it. Major events like WrestleMania are in the past, but you've got Major League Baseball games. You've got the end of the regular season for the NBA, and obviously beyond that into the playoffs. Memphis won't be there this year, but maybe you want to go somewhere else and check out a game. Whatever the case might be, Game Time's phenomenal. I love it, and you most certainly should as well. There's last-minute deals where you can save up to 60% buying last-minute tickets for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, all sorts of different things. They have all-in pricing, having that feature. The total is there up front, no surprise fees at checkout, and they have the lowest price guarantee, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, Brandon Clarke, starting center. Not as wild as you think. Stick with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, your host for this episode. No DeMichael Cole, a well-deserved day off after a couple of solo shows with me enjoying myself at WrestleMania 40. Happy to be back with you, though, dear listener, dear viewer. And I watched Grizzlies basketball. I do want to talk about the core four at some point, doing a reuniting. It felt so good. Didn't feel like the right time this episode because the Grizzlies obviously played last night and they play again tonight. So lots of content to get to in terms of actual play on the court. Maybe our Thursday edition of the show with no game directly happening. Obviously, they play on Friday, but we have a bit of a breather. So maybe that'll allow us to extend. And I'd love to get to Michael's take. I know he talked about it on a recent episode, but I have a unique experience covering the team as long as I have. I'd love to share my thoughts with DeMichael and get his vibe from my takeaways. But we'll talk about that on another episode down the road. Right now, I want to talk about Brandon Clarke because I mentioned earlier in the show that he was the best player for Memphis on the floor in this game, and it wasn't particularly close. Now, he only grabs 1 rebound. That's concerning, obviously. But when you have Victor Wembanyama on the floor and you are almost a foot shorter than a guy that you would be contending with as a potential starting center, obviously Trey Jemison was that guy in this contest for the Grizzlies, that's problematic. Victor Wembanyama is a freak in a good way, physical freak. Crazy to see that he's going to be in the Southwest Division. Think about this real quick tangent. Victor Wembanyama, Luka Doncic, the Houston Rockets with Jalen Green, who appears to be figuring things out. New Orleans has Zion Williamson. Southwest Division looks pretty rough. Now, the Grizzlies have Ja Morant and Desmond Bane and Jaren Jackson Jr. I'd put those 3 up against anybody and roll the ball out on the court and see who plays and who wins and who competes, right? But Southwest Division is going to be pretty interesting next season, assuming things continue in their upward trajectory. 5 teams that should be contending for playoff and play-in spots. I doubt the Spurs sit on their hands while Victor Wembanyama has to be the universal, unanimous Rookie of the Year. He looked the part at times against the Grizzlies on Tuesday, but Brandon Clarke also had some success, even though Wembanyama at his size was on the floor. Could Clarke start at the 5? Obviously on social media, lots of other places where Memphis Grizzlies fans have conversations, what to do with the draft pick, Donovan Clingan, Zach Edey. DeMichael talked about it on yesterday's show, and how watching that national championship game and seeing how Clingan struggled with Edey at times. And like we talked about earlier on in the program, how you don't want to react to one game in a lost regular season towards the end of it, right? Even though it's a national championship game, it's important to not react to one game there either. You have to practice the same type of discipline, even in a game with that high of stakes. Clingan has been an excellent passer, great screener, was completely dominant against Illinois defensively. He had a heck of a season. Zach Edey obviously has had a heck of a career on top of a great season. I think both of those guys should still be in the conversation, depending on pick preference down the road. And we'll talk more about that, of course, as we prep for the NBA draft. Brandon Clarke as a starting five. I'm not sure that it matters, because to me, the two guys that, regardless of what the Grizzlies do at the center position, barring some major trade, like they go and swing for, Bam Adebayo, and I'm not even saying Miami would trade Bam Adebayo. And if Miami would trade Bam Adebayo, it almost certainly would have to involve somebody like a John Morant, Desmond Bane, Jaren Jackson Jr., which the Grizzlies probably aren't going to get involved in that business. The point I'm trying to make is the two dudes that are going to play the most together in the front court, regardless of who starts, is probably Jaren Jackson Jr. and Brandon Clarke, because of their defensive versatility, because of their ability to switch and do all sorts of things on the perimeter. And it allows for Jaren, even though Brandon is not a true center, it enables Jaren to be able to play more of that weak side off ball, help defender depending on matchups. And that's where Jaren really thrived as a defensive player of the year last season. He hasn't been able to do that as much this season. That's one of many reasons that his numbers on the defensive side have tailed off compared to where he was last year. I think he's still a second team all defense type this season. We'll talk more about that, I'm sure, on future episodes. When it comes to the Clarke question, it's not necessarily about him starting, it's about him finishing. And if the Grizzlies go the path of least resistance, which in my opinion would be not trading anybody or anything, maybe you move up because you have the 2 second-round picks in this draft. Maybe you tag those two together, a future second, try to get into the end of the first round, maybe. But Memphis, assuming they don't make a trade, they'll be in the mid-lottery, 6, 7, 8-ish. You take a big like a Donovan Clingan. Could he start? Sure, he could start. But he might only play 20 to 25 minutes, and Brandon Clarke's the guy closing games in the fourth quarter. Could Brandon Clarke start in that scenario if that were to play out? Yeah, Brandon Clarke could start. Clingan would come in, play with either of those guys as a 4. Could also maybe have some GG Jackson fun or something along those lines. Go a little small ball 4 next to a true center in Clingan. Or any true center they bring in. Pick your poison there. I certainly wouldn't take Edey in the lottery. I wouldn't take any other big in the lottery beside Clingan. But if that's the move, it's not necessarily who starts, it's who plays the most together, and it's who finishes the game. Starting matters, don't get me wrong. If it didn't matter, then you wouldn't have the big deal over it every year, and you wouldn't have who's out on the floor getting those big introductions. And how you begin games is important, but how you close them is even more important. And I think that the best lineup for Memphis next season, barring some major trade, is going to be the 4 guys, John Morant, Desmond Bane, Marcus Smart, Jaren Jackson Jr., and insert one of Vince Williams Jr., GG Jackson, Luke Kennard, whatever the situation calls for. If you need elite defensive energy, Vince Williams Jr. is your guy. If you need a bucket at all 3 different levels, a potential scorer in an isolation situation, you go GG Jackson. You need 3-point shooting and spacing, you go Luke Kennard. But I think your 4 are Jaren, Clarke, your 4 are Smart, Bane, Ja, and Jaren. Clarke is a part of that conversation too if you need to go big, if you need defensive versatility. And maybe if you need that offensive versatility, you take out a Marcus Smart and you bring in somebody like a Luke Kennard or GG Jackson. The Grizzlies have options and movable pieces. So whether Clarke starts or not, it's whether or not he finishes the game and how the Grizzlies respond to the center position. If they think Jaren is their guy, who is the guy next to him more often than not? I think it's going to be Brandon Clarke because of what we've seen so far this season, because of the explosiveness clearly being back. He continues to score the ball well at and around the rim. He's elite in that way. And imagine once he's back out there with Joe Morant, which we haven't seen in a long time, right? Over a calendar year. Imagine once he's back out there consistently with Desmond Bane. It's going to be a lot of fun to see. And you know what else we've never seen? We've never seen Brandon Clarke next to Marcus Smart. That's the reality. The unfortunate reality of the season, we won't have enough data to firmly say that should be Clarke's spot, whether it's a 5-4, whatever you want to call it. But is Clarke a part of that starting and, more importantly, finishing conversation? Yeah, absolutely. Let me know what you think in the comments. Is Brandon Clarke a 5? Does it matter if he's next to Jaren? How they're deployed? Different schematic ideas? If you're a more X's and O's type basketball mind, by all means, hit me up in the comments. Let me know what you're thinking. And one of the fun things about Locked On is you can do that as part of a friendly community, right? It's not like Fox Sports or ESPN where you have to turn the volume down with all that shouting. You can continue your Locked On fun with Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every single day. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by BetterHelp. Sometimes we all need the opportunity to get stuff off our chest, right? Like this whole season has felt like that for the Memphis Grizzlies. Injuries, rotations that can't be finalized, bodies and players coming and going. Who the heck's playing against the Cleveland Cavaliers? I don't know, and neither do you. Woosah, right? You need to get that off your chest sometimes, especially with somebody who's unbiased on your life. Therapy obviously can feel like something that's bigger than what's going on with your favorite sports team, but if it's significant to you, then it might be significant to your mental health, and obviously therapy can help in that process. Most of us have bigger problems, and it's important to get things off your chest, regardless of the size, every once in a while. If you're thinking of starting therapy, you should give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible, and suited to your schedule. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. When we've come back on Locked On Grizzlies, we'll finish out this episode talking Grizzlies Cavs as best we can. Stick with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, and I feel like I'm not doing great with our ad breaks today because I got to be honest with you, dear listener, dear viewer. Like, I enjoyed talking about Brandon Clarke because he's one of the guys that for sure is going to be a part of this thing, barring a trade, when the team's trying to be good again. I'll talk about G.G. Jackson and being patient with single-game performance because that's a guy who, theoretically speaking, is going to be a part of the rotation when the team's trying to be good again. Otherwise, going into this game against the Cleveland Cavaliers, I don't know who's going to play. I don't know if Brandon Clarke's going to get an injury management designation on the second night of a back-to-back, which is almost certainly going to occur. Who the heck? It's going to be G.G. Jackson going for a 50 burger. And don't get me wrong, I'd love to see a side of that with fries. The fries being assists, passing the ball to other people and completing those passes in made buckets. But if Brandon Clarke doesn't play, do we see Jaren Jackson Jr. again this season? Maybe, maybe not. This is the last back-to-back. The Grizzlies, this is also the last home game, and Memphis has been, the last away game. And Memphis has been better on the road this season than they have been at home. So how does that connect for the Grizzlies? Does it matter given the current state of play with a bunch of 10 days and hardship waiver and two-way contracts eating up these minutes as the season limps along? It's tempting to just talk to you about WrestleMania. Dear listener, dear viewer, I had a blast. It was phenomenal. Highly recommended. 10 out of 10. Philly has great food. It was a great environment. Had a wonderful time. But I'm not supposed to do that. Understandably so. Hit me up on X at Joe Mullinax if you want to talk to me about WrestleMania. I'll happily talk finishing the story and final bosses there. comments too. But the reality is the Memphis Grizzlies have their third to last basketball game tonight. What do you look for in a season where it's gone this poorly in terms of players actually being on the court? I can't imagine Brandon Clarke plays on the second night of a back-to-back. Does anybody fill that void? Fingers crossed. If they don't, Memphis will have 8 or 9 active players, and they're going to have to do the best they can against the Cleveland Cavaliers team that is playing for something. In the Eastern Conference, the Cavs are already in, but seeding matters. Seeding matters. And the Cleveland Cavaliers are going to come out and try to win and win quickly because they can get their guys off the court and they can move along to the next game. So it's going to be painful because at least against the Spurs, it was a game of 2 bad teams, right? The Spurs are going to be done after this weekend. The Grizzlies are going to be done. Yeah, Memphis had a terrible third quarter, didn't score the ball well at all. Yuck, right? But it was 2 bad teams. Watching the game tonight is going to be mildly depressing because over the last several years, and I've talked about this, I know DeMichael has as well, over the last several years, we've been getting ready for the playoffs, baby. Postseason basketball. Whether it's the play-in, whether it's the actual playoffs over these last 2 seasons where they've been the number 2 seed, we have been thinking big. And now we're just playing out the slate like we were 6 years ago, back when things were bad the last time we were all together in that poor state of play. But the good news is, compared to that time, is there is a legitimate light at the end of the tunnel. Back then, you had a general manager that you had no idea how the hell they were going to get out of the hole they were in. Now you've got Zach Kleiman. Now you've got Taylor Jenkins. Now you have a front office and a brain trust of a coaching staff that you're a little bit more comfortable in, especially the front office aspect. J.B. Bickerstaff, if he gets any blame for the end of grit and grind, he most certainly shouldn't. And he has gotten to a place as a coach for the Cleveland Cavaliers that he's getting the respect he deserves. Pretty impressive job this year. Cleveland is not that far back from the Grizzlies in terms of injuries. The Grizzlies are the team that have been the most impacted this season compared to any other NBA team. But Cleveland might be the team that's been most impacted by injuries and still competing at a playoff level. J.B. Bickerstaff's a good basketball coach. It was a front office concern back then. We don't have that concern now. Plus, I think Taylor Jenkins is a pretty good basketball coach. And you know that the roster is in place. They're just not actively playing right now. So you have something to look forward to, which is a positive. But it's still going to sting watching a former Memphis Grizzlies coach and his not new team, because he's been there a while now, and his team getting ready for the playoffs while you are playing out the slate with guys that, if you're being honest, if you had to say whose team they were on and you weren't watching Locked On Grizzlies, maybe you wouldn't be as confident in who they were. That's the state of things in Memphis. So who plays tonight? I don't know. Will the Grizzlies win? Probably not. But at this stage, that's what you want. You want lottery positioning. You're looking ahead to next year. Difference between the last time we were this bad and now, there's a light at the end of the tunnel going into the 2024-2025 campaign. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. The next time we're together, it'll be a Thursday edition of the podcast. We'll see if DeMichael's back with me. It's an earlier start against Cleveland tonight, so it's possible DeMichael is able to get his beat writer duties done and hop on with me for a duo recording going into Thursday. Whether it's just me or whether it's both of us, we'll talk Grizzlies Cavs. I will give some of my core 4 thoughts. That Marc Gasol jersey ceremony, I know DeMichael did a great job covering that, but I haven't had a chance to talk about it. And seeing all 4 of them together, I got in my feels. So I do want to talk about that some, and we'll take a look at the upcoming weekend at home for Memphis, maybe talk arena plans and upgrades. That's been in the news lately, all that sort of stuff. That'll be what we focus on in our next episode. Make sure you're liking, commenting, rating, reviewing, subscribing, wherever you get your podcasts, Amazon, Apple, Spotify, YouTube. We're proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. Make sure you're checking out Locked On Sports Today on YouTube or Amazon Fire TV in the free channels app. Wherever you get the podcast, hopefully you're an everydayer. Every time an episode drops, you're with us here on Locked On Grizzlies. Enjoy tonight's game as best you can. Thank you so much for being with me. It's great to be back. Looking forward to closing out the week with you here on Locked On Grizzlies. Have a